There are several passages in the Bible where people were caught taking naps, and today we're going to be discussing two of those, and we're going to begin by reading a scripture passage about three men who just couldn't help themselves but fall asleep. Our text is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 36 through 46, and it reads, "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over and pray.' He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, 'I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me.' And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, 'My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want.' Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'So, could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' Again, he went away for the second time and prayed, 'My Father, if this cannot pass until I drink it, your will be done.' Again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So, leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.'" How can you be sleeping? These are the words that they shouted many years before this story that we just read to a man named Jonah, who was sleeping in the bowels of a boat that was being tossed by a terrible storm. And the aspiring, albeit reluctant, prophet was on a mission. Rather, he was fleeing a mission and on a separate mission of his own. He was heading in the opposite direction from where he was told to go by God. He had been called to an uncomfortable and dangerous place to preach a message that he did not believe those people were deserving of. He was called to go to the wicked city of Nineveh and tell them to repent. But he decided that he'd rather not. So he set sail in the opposite direction. And a nap at sea can signify many things. How is it that Jonah finds himself asleep at the bottom of the boat in the midst of a storm? Now, a nap at sea could be a simple snooze to pass the time, but a nap in the midst of a storm can tell a different story. It can indicate that the one sleeping would rather not face the noise. I know that on some mornings when I am especially stressed or maybe even depressed, I'd rather not get out of bed. I lie there with my eyes pressed shut, sometimes for over an hour, not quite ready to face the day. Perhaps this is why Jonah slept. But to everyone else, those caught in the storm, the question comes, how can you be sleeping when the world is turned upside down, when our lives are on the line? And this question haunts us today. I think that the story of the disciples in the passage that we just read serves as a warning, if we can allow it. A warning that even in the midst of dire circumstances, many of us have trouble staying awake. The disciples surely knew things were heating up. Jesus had just told them moments before that his time was coming, and that wasn't the first time he had said it. He had been warning them of the dire consequences of his ministry for some time now. He tried to tell his friends what they were in for, and one of them, Peter, talked the big talk just moments before this garden scene. He said, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." I might have said similar cavalier things when I was fairly far removed from danger about what I would do should danger befall me. But then the text goes on. Jesus, after hearing this, says to his disciples that they would leave him and flee him, and that Peter would deny him 3 times. And it says that he said this to all the disciples. So it's easy to make big promises before it's time to make good on the promises, and it's easy to feel brave, especially before your mettle is actually tested. And my guess is the disciples are entering into this next scene with a fair amount of confidence. But then they all go to the garden, and he instructs them to wait behind. But he takes Peter, James, and John along with him, and he confides in them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me. He apparently needed somebody to stand by his side. Then he goes a bit further on and he prays his heart out. Father, if possible, take this cup from me, but in the end, not my will, but yours. This is the prayer of someone who would rather stay inside or away or safe. Jesus is allowed to feel those emotions. He was, after all, human, like you and like me. He would rather leave the garden and go home to commune with the people that he loves most in life. He doesn't want to raise a ruckus, much less put himself or his friends in danger. So he pleads with God, please, if possible, show me some other path. There's gotta be another way. And then Jesus turns around and he sees his friends and they are fast asleep. When you are asleep, the ills of the world are for a time turned off. The only way the ills of the world follow us into our sleep is if they visit us in form of dreams, but our dreams even are often detached from reality. So much so that when someone thinks of an idea that is wholly unrealistic, they say something like, you must be dreaming in response. Perhaps the disciples were dreaming because to not dream would be to face the darkness and the fear that met Jesus in the garden. Jesus, a man of grace and compassion, gives his friends another chance, saying, so you cannot stay awake with me 1 hour? Okay, stay awake and pray with me into the time of trial. Your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. And there it is. The balance between where our heart pulls us and the risks that the journey poses to our flesh. Try to hold these two things in tension, the risk and where our heart is pulling us. And we often feel bad about so many things. I feel bad that children are hungry in the world. I feel bad that so many hearts are breaking in the world. I feel bad that my black and brown brothers and sisters are so upset and angry and in grief. And there's a certain kind of comfort in the feeling of getting upset. It's as if to feel strongly means that we are affecting some change, when in fact, we are not. I'm only feeling and wishing and hoping, but if the flesh does not move, if the flesh falls asleep and slips into dreams, then the agonizing Christ continues to plead, to fear, to hope, to cry, to pray, regather itself, and to take the next hard steps towards the cross Jesus is called to carry. I see the agonizing Christ right now, the Christ who is praying hard, tearfully, anxiously, with a broken heart in the garden. I see that Christ right now in my black and brown brothers and sisters. This is not new. Many have seen it before. This connection between the cross of Jesus and the burdens that people still carry today. The black liberation theologian James Cone wrote in 2011 in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and I'm quoting him. Unfortunately, During the course of 2,000 years of Christian history, this symbol of salvation has been detached from any reference to the ongoing suffering and oppression of human beings. Those whom Ignacio Illa Curia, the Salvadorian martyr, called the crucified peoples of history. The cross has been transformed into a harmless, non-offensive ornament that Christians wear around their necks, rather than reminding us of the cost of discipleship. It has become a form of cheap grace, an easy way to salvation that doesn't force us to confront the power of Christ's message and mission. Until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America, and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. James Cone, From the Cross and the Lynching Tree. But that is heavy, and I'd rather go to bed. I'd rather curl up on my rock with the disciples and sleep the night away in Gethsemane, or I'd rather sit this one out behind my computer with my books, daydreaming of other times. But our comfort in those other times was only possible because we've been asleep for decades, if not centuries. People keep wondering why these things continue to happen. Why are we facing the same problems we faced back in 1965 or 1935 or 1885? White America sleeps. It has the comfort and the time to do so in most circumstances, at least in my circumstances. But not all. While it is true that black and brown people are disproportionately more poor and disenfranchised in the United States, there are more poor white people in the United States than black and brown people. Not all white people have been able to sleep, so this struggle for black and brown people and racial justice is really for us all, for the health and well-being of us all. And this is why, as I've marched during these past 2 weeks, I've been happy to see as many white allies and black and brown people, sometimes more. We are, some of us, I humbly hope, are waking up. But in the meantime, they should never have been weeping and praying in the garden for so long. The scene shifts, and the sleeping disciples are caught unawares. Jesus says, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. My betrayer is at hand." Peter puts up a bit of resistance, but it's too late. He's not ready to walk with Jesus through what's next. And verse 56 reads, "Then all the disciples deserted him and fled." Probably, after such a long night, they went home and fell back to sleep. After all, isn't this what we've always done? Not this time, I hope. Now, I'm a realist and somewhat of a student of history, and I realize that we are not about to usher in an era of perfect utopian delight, but this is a unique moment in history. Those who have been a part of these struggles for a long time can feel the shift in momentum. People who were back there in the 60s have told me, or I've heard them interviewed and read in articles, that they feel this energy that is all too familiar, can be related to that time in history. And we can see the changing of minds and the melting of hearts. More and more people are seeing on an intuitive level the similarities between the cross and the lynching tree. And meaningful reforms are happening faster than anyone ever thought possible. But As is true after any invigorating day outside, there is the temptation for us to fall back asleep when it is beyond imperative that we stay awake. Perhaps you have recently been awakened to the plight of the poor and of the black and brown Americans. Perhaps you are hearing their stories for the first time, and they have your attention. Careful. Don't fall asleep. Stay awake. Listen and be ready for your moment to stand with them and fight for them. Or, if you have been as one that is wakened from a deep sleep and you aren't sure of what all the noise is about, because I know not everyone has we're not in complete agreement about this moment in history, white America. This pastor, I want you to know, is convinced that we are seeing a movement towards positive change. And when I describe what I'm seeing in theological language, the best way I can put it is the Spirit is moving. And I personally feel caught up in its current, in its life-giving, albeit disorienting current. But if you remain unconvinced, I'd invite you to keep your eyes open. At least stay awake in your own way. Discern, speak out if you are troubled, lead with love and prayer, and try to understand. Refrain from judging until you're sure you thoroughly understand where Black Americans are coming from. Listen, listen, listen. Read, read, read their books and their stories, and listen to their voices and believe the stories of the persons who are speaking from their own direct experience. And if you feel you must condemn, make sure you've done the legwork. I've read on Facebook far too many accusatory and dismissive voices who strike me as reactionary and uninformed. But one thing the church must not do in this moment is fall asleep or remain asleep, as we have been asleep for all too long. We must have something to say. And I think the God of peace is calling us to peace. But as the prophet Isaiah reminds us in Isaiah 59, the way of peace they know not, and there is no justice in their paths. Their roads have been made crooked. No one who walks in them knows peace. Without justice, there is no peace. Consider these words in the times when so many feet are marching in the streets. The night before I was arrested 2 years ago for these very causes, poverty and racial justice, amongst other things. Arrested on purpose to make a point. The day before, the evening before, I listened to, in full, a reading of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And if you have not read it in full, read it. Please find a copy online and read it, or listen to an audio reading of it. And I'd like for us to conclude with some of the words that gripped me and helped me stay awake in that moment when I wanted to pass the cup and take a nap. And so I leave it to the great Dr. King as he reads in his own words the letter in part that he wrote from jail. And remember, these words were written from prison, like so many of the Apostle Paul's letters from so long ago.
Oppressed people cannot remain depressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained. Consciously, unconsciously, he has been caught up by the spirit of the times, and with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, The United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and he must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist. But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus Christ. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality, and thus fell below that environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. I had hoped that the white moderate would see this need. Perhaps I was too optimistic. Perhaps I expected too much. I suppose I should have realized that few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. Let me take note of my other major disappointment. I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions, and I am not unmindful of these. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cords of life shall lengthen. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church, but this never came through. All too many ministers found themselves more cautious than courageous and remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows.
Well, there's not really much more I could add to that, nor should, except to remind you and me one more time that it is not time to fall asleep, but to stay awake. That we must join the grieving Christ in the garden and walk with him, take up that cross to whatever end. Our time of trial has come for the umpteenth time. Will we be caught asleep again? God of peace, give us the grace to stay awake.